In this famous chapter on communion, 1 Corinthians 11:26, we're told that when we take communion, that we're supposed to do it as a way of proclaiming his death until he comes. I thought I was supposed to proclaim his life, his resurrection. Why proclaim his death? And besides, I thought this was actually a study on Satan, so what does this have to do with anything? Well, I'll show you. Let's find out. The gospel reveals that we're separated from God by nature, not by our works. Our works are symptoms of our separated nature. It's not that we do wrong things. We are wrong. There's something wrong with us. Our spiritual nature, our spiritual genes, our spiritual family tree's roots come from one of two spirit beings, either God's or Satan's. We're also told that God never forgives sin. He forgives sinners under certain circumstances, but he always kills sin. And that's one of the reasons why we have this concept of sacrifice that comes over and over and over in the Bible. It's also one of the reasons why almost any culture in any language around the world, somewhere, either currently or in their past, there is this ingrained concept of sacrifice, that there has to be some kind of an atonement, a covering for their sin with whatever God it is that they've imagined. So let's look at that word atonement. As I said, it means to cover. And in Hebrews 9:22 it says, without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness of sins. There's no way to cover the debt. There's no way to cover the gap. If somebody asks you, can you cover this check that you just wrote? What they're asking is, if there's a gap between your bank account and this check, will you make up that gap? Will you cover it? If you're in Vegas and you're betting on the sports, there's covering the spread. If there's a gap between the score that you proposed it would be and the score that the bookies are presenting, if there's a gap there, can you cover that gap? Is that spread going to be covered? If you're in battle, in war, and you're in a firefight, and in your squad or your platoon, there's somebody who's exposed and you want to reassure them, you would say, I've got you covered. And that means if there's a gap in their eyesight, if there's a gap in their attention where they can't see, like behind them, you will watch that. You will close that span. You will cover that gap. Now, in the Bible, that gap is always covered by an innocent, sinless being, a living being, having its life taken away. So what happens with this concept of sacrifice is you put your hand on the forehead of the animal, symbolically transferring your sin to this thing that is sinless, because it's an animal. It's sinless. And then when it's killed, when that animal dies, your sin dies with it. Okay? That's really important, because sometimes we get the idea that when God forgives our sin, it's like the great cosmic, forget about it. No problem. That isn't it. That's not it. He does not wink at sin. He kills sin. He never excuses it. It's part of his nature. God is light. Sin is darkness. Sin comes from that other spirit, Satan. It's dark. Light always eradicates darkness. When you want to make a room, a dark room, lighter, you don't go in with a bucket and try to pull the darkness out, to shovel it out, to scoop it out. What you do is you turn on the light, and the light instantly eradicates the darkness every time, all the time. God says, I am light, Satan is dark, and that's the same principle. It's part of God's nature. It's almost like he can't help it. It's a character trait of his. He is perfect love. And we'll look at what that means in a little bit. But anything that is not perfect love, anything that does not have his nature in it, is sin, and he eradicates it. You, a way we can talk about that is, what if you have cancer, What if cancer is like sin and it's systemic in you? What if you're riddled with cancer? You can go in for radiation treatment, right? And the radiation will kill the cancer. The radiance of God's glory kills sin. But if you're riddled with it, if it's completely metastasized in your system and you're full of cancer, and they do enough radiation to kill the cancer, that's the good news. The bad news is it also kills you. And that's the concept in the Bible. That's why God says to Moses, look, I know you want to see me. I know what you want to be in my presence, just like Adam and Eve wanted to be back in my presence. But here's the problem. Moses, you have sin. The cross hasn't happened yet. And if you look in my face, you'll die. So you hide behind this rock. The rock was Christ, obviously. It's a picture. And I'll pass by you, and you can at least see me as I pass by. But you can't look in my face lest you die. Moses was covered by the rock. So remember that God never forgives the presence of sin, that he always kills it. Remember that he forgives sinners, but only on certain conditions. Remember that the sin has to be covered up. It has to be atoned for. That gap between God's spirit and our spirit has to be covered. Hebrews 2 says this, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that is, flesh and blood. He became a human, that through death he might destroy the one who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. That's pretty cool. I mean, who would have thunk that? Satan certainly didn't see that one coming. That God was going to kill death with death. Remember, the wages of sin is death. The payment for sin, the consequence of sinning is separation from God, the only source of life in the universe, meaning the only other option is death. So anytime you see death, you know there's the presence of sin somewhere. And God's going to kill that with death itself. That's the cross. We'll look at that in a little bit. There's a lot of pictures of this covering, this grace that we get of covering our sin, of atoning for that nature so that God can kill the sin without killing the sinner. One of the first places you see that is in Genesis. It's Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. It's God's presence. They're in God's presence. They sin. They can't be in God's presence or they'll die. So he has two angels, or several cherubim actually. He doesn't say two. It just says plural cherubim. These very high, powerful angels are going to guard God's holiness. They're going to guard his presence, and they're going to guard us. They're going to prevent us from dying, humanity. So Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. You can't be in God's presence or you're going to die. They try to cover their sin with fig leaves. They're self-conscious, right? They're conscious of self. Before they were only conscious of being joined with God. Now they're aware that God isn't there and they're self-conscious. Uh-oh, I'm naked. I've got to cover up. They didn't have that before. And they try to do it with fig leaves. And God shows up and he's like, yeah, guys, that ain't going to cut it. That ain't going to cut it. And so what he does is he performs the very first sacrifice. God himself. He kills some kind of an animal and he takes their skin and he covers Adam and Eve with these animal skins. He's covering their self-consciousness, their sin. You see this covering again in the story of Noah and the flood. The world is full of sin. God brings this flood, destroying the sin, but he covers it up in these rainbow colors. You see it again, even right down to the rainbow theme with Joseph. Joseph is one of the children of Israel. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and he's got the 12 tribes, right? Each son becomes one of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. They're jealous of the father's son because the father clothed his son in glory, a glorious multicolored robe. Get it? Israel is jealous of the father's son because of his glory. Same thing happens later. Joseph, however, winds up forgiving his brothers for what they eventually do to him. Same thing that Jesus Christ is going to do, are greater than Joseph. In a previous Bible study, we went into detail on this. So I'm not going to do that now, but it's an extremely interesting thing. When you read the Gospels, we're told that Jesus is put in a white robe during his trial. He's then put into a scarlet robe, and he's put into a purple robe. And he's finally clothed with a fourth color, blue. So you have these four colors. And in our previous study on the tabernacle, which is a picture of the presence of God, we find those exact same four colors. They're fabric ceilings, so to speak, covering this tabernacle. Now, if you recall, the tabernacle is like a mobile temple for when the people are brought out of Egypt, but they're not yet in the promised land. They're wandering in this wilderness while God trains them and disciplines them and teaches them through Moses. And in this tabernacle, one of the important things for this, again, I'm not going to go through this because that's a previous lesson, but in the tabernacle, there's this place called the Holy of Holies that nobody's allowed to go. And in that is this crypt, this coffin called the Ark of the Covenant. And I say that because in the Hebrew, there's two words for this. And sometimes it's the word they simply mean for a box where you put things. Sometimes it's the word they use for coffin, where you put the body of somebody. Now, on this ark, on this coffin, on this tomb, was a slab, a flat slab, that was called the mercy seat. And to people in the first century anyway, who were used to the judgment seat, a place where a judge would sit as a sign of his authority, like the judge's bench that we have today, they would dispense either condemnation or mercy. And God says, I'm gonna give you this coffin, and inside of this coffin there's several things. For now I'm just going to talk about one. One of them was the two slabs with the Ten Commandments, the law. Remember, the law kills. The law condemns you. The law is a description of the perfect character of God, which you don't have. You're separated from him. You don't have his nature. Therefore, you're condemned to death because he's the only source of life in the universe. So that's why it's a coffin. It's got the Ten Commandments in it. It's the law that condemns us. But over that, there's good news. Here's the gospel part. There's a mercy seat. There's mercy. If a judge could sit on this bench, if a judge could sit on this judgment seat, God says he'll dispense mercy. And then God does something that makes you go, oh no. He says, Moses, you got to make this exactly the way I tell you because it's a pattern of something that's in heaven. And he says, on this mercy seat, I want you to build 2 gold cherubim. These angels are to have their wings reaching over the mercy seat and touching. See, he's saying it's impossible for anybody to sit on this to dispense mercy. Only God can condemn you, and only God can give you mercy from the condemnation. No man can do that. So nobody could ever sit on this. You remember another study that we did where we talked about the fact that the gospel is God putting himself in creation in order to save that creation without killing that creation. And God shows us what that looks like in the Old Testament in many, many different ways. And one of the ways is he gives us types of Christ. And we talked about the extensive parallels in detail of the biographies of Joseph, Moses, Joshua, and David, how they parallel the life of Jesus as foretold in the gospel. It's an amazing study. If you haven't seen that, go back and look. Go to our website, rootsforfruit.org, and you'll see each one of these laid out there. Um, and what I've got on there are abbreviated versions. There are at least 70 parallels in the biography of Joseph that were given in Genesis with the biography of Jesus. It's that detailed. So we have these four major types of Christ in the Old Testament, but here's the question. Does he also give us types of Satan? Well, obviously you know what the study is about, so the answer has to be yes, right? Let's go look at that. First thing I want to do is we're going to look at two types of Satan in the Old Testament, and then we're going to see him unveiled. And the first place that we need to look is in the prophet Ezekiel, and it's in Ezekiel 28. And I've pulled some verses from these passages. Let's just read them together. The word of the Lord came to me again, saying, Son of man, say to the prince of Tyre, Thus says the Lord God, because your heart is lifted up, and you say, I am a god, I sit in the seat of gods, I am in the midst of the seas. Yet you are a man and not a god. Though you set your heart as the heart of a god, behold, you are wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that can be hidden from you. There's no secret that can be hidden. With your wisdom and your understanding, you have gained riches for yourself and gathered gold and silver into your treasuries. By your great wisdom in trade, you have increased your riches, and your heart is lifted up because of your riches. Now he skips down a little bit, and he's still talking to this king of Tyre. The thing about Tyre that I would like to point out right now is it's still there. It's in Lebanon, and at this time that was a seaport city. And in the literal history behind this, what was happening is it was the best seaport from which people in the Middle East could ship their goods out across the Mediterranean or take goods in from other parts of the Mediterranean. Well, the guy who's controlling this seaport had it pretty sweet because if you were going to buy or sell, if you're going to ship or receive there, you had to rent his ships, you had to rent his captain, you had to rent his deck crew, you had to rent his warehouses on his wharves, you had to pay a docking fee, and you had to buy his wharf workers, his warehousemen, his dock workers. They had to be paid. And then on top of all that, you had to pay him a tax. So he accumulated great, great wealth. So God is talking to this guy. And then as you skip down in that same chapter, he says, Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald, with gold. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created until iniquity or sin was found in you. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within and you sinned. Therefore, I cast you as a profane, that means unholy, common thing out of the mountain of God. And I destroyed you, O covering cherub. Cherubs cover, remember? They cover the mercy seat. They cover the entrance to the Garden of Eden. They cover the way back to God's presence. I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of those fiery stones. So we see Satan was or is a cherub, an angelic being who represented God in very amazing ways, but he invented something. He developed this thing that we call sin. This iniquity was found in him. Now, God grants him access to heaven, but Satan can no longer dwell there. The other word for dwelling in the Bible, the technical term is tabernacle, just like the tabernacle of Moses was a dwelling place for God in his creation. It's a place where you abide. It's a place like you would call home. Satan can never call heaven home again. He's cast out of the spirit universe and he's cast into the physical universe. Remember Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven? That's what he's talking about. But here's what I want to point out to you. Check this out. He starts out this passage and he says, Son of man, say to the prince of Tyre. And as you listen to God talking to this guy, it's like, yeah, he's talking to a really arrogant, boastful butthead, somebody who's a wheeler dealer, a strong businessman who does all this commerce and trading, and he's able to cheat people probably and overtax them. So he's full of himself. But as you go through it, you realize he's no longer talking to a human being. This is a cherub, a covering cherub who was in the Garden of Eden. It's not a human being. And when he addresses that person, he says, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre. The human being, the actual literal historical person who is the ruler of this real town in Tyre, is called the prince, but over and above the prince is another authority. It's another spirit that's driving him. It's the king. And the king is the spirit that God is actually addressing here. And obviously we're picking up on the clue that that spirit is actually Satan. I'm going to show you one more type of Satan in the Old Testament. Go to Isaiah 14. And in Isaiah 14, you see the same thing happening again. It starts out, obviously, he's talking to a person. It shall come to pass in the day, the Lord gives you rest from your sorrow and from your fear and the hard bondage in which you were made to serve. He's talking to the children of Israel after they were cast out of the land, that you will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased. Oh, the golden city has ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers. He who struck the people, that is us, the children of Israel, he who struck the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he who ruled the nations in anger, is persecuted and no one hinders. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. Hell from beneath is excited about you to meet you at your coming. It stirs up the dead for you. All the chief ones of the earth it has raised up from their thrones. All the kings of the nations. Now, he's literally talking about Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, who assaulted Jerusalem 3 times at God's behest as a form of punishing his children for not doing what he wanted them to do, for not representing him to the world. They blended in with the world instead of representing God to the world. They became just like the world, and they refused to repent despite all the prophets that God sent. They killed the prophets. So God raises up this guy from Babylon, this emperor, Nebuchadnezzar, and he has him go in there and wipe out Jerusalem. And Nebuchadnezzar does it in three stages. But remember, he's doing it at the behest of God. Now let's keep going. Here's the switcheroo again. God says, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. I don't think he's talking about King Nebuchadnezzar anymore. I don't think he ever fell out of heaven. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations, for you have said in your heart, now listen carefully, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. And God says, yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, that's hell, to the lowest depths of the pit. Now there's some interesting things here. First of all, when God is saying, you're going to go to hell, that's what I made for you, you're going to go down there, he can't possibly be talking about the literal human being who was inspired at one point by this spirit, this satanic spirit, this Lucifer spirit, this fallen cherub. Can't possibly. And you know how I know that? Because Nebuchadnezzar repented. Nebuchadnezzar was disciplined by God, and for 7 years he went completely insane. And he went from being a king to a cow. He grazed grass like a cow for 7 years. And then he finally comes to his senses, and he realizes, if God can do that to me, and I thought I was all that great, I'm nothing. I'm nothing. And he repents. In fact, he repents so much that God actually has this guy write one of the chapters in the Bible that you have in your hands. He writes Daniel chapter 4. So he's not talking about Nebuchadnezzar going to hell, but he is talking about the spirit that incited Nebuchadnezzar to do this. I'll explain that in just a second when we get to Job, because I said God sent Nebuchadnezzar in there, so how could Satan be the one inciting him? I'll show you when we get to Job. But what I want you to focus on right now is the spirit that we see in Satan. Look at the spirit. He says, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will. I will be like the Most High. Remember what he baited Eve with in the Garden of Eden? If you eat this fruit, you shall surely not die. You will be like God. Contrast that with the Spirit of Christ. Jesus says in John 6:38, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Then Jesus said to them, this is John 8:28, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing of myself. When Jesus taught us to pray, he said, when you pray, pray like this. Say, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. There's another garden. We have a Garden of Eden where Adam does his own will. He doesn't want to lose his wife, his bride, Eve, so he willingly, knowingly takes that sin on himself so he could stay with his bride. There's another Adam. Paul calls Jesus the last Adam. He's in another garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. He doesn't want to lose his bride either, the bride of Christ, you, the church. And so he does the same thing. He takes that sin, but he doesn't want to. That's not his will. He says, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. He reverses what Adam did. He does the same thing, but he does it at the behest of God, not in his own will. Pretty amazing stuff. Now I want to get to Job, and we'll start wrapping it up here. Job is interesting. We've seen two types of Satan. Now we're going to see Satan right out on the stage with a Klieg light on him, and you're going to see what he's really doing and what he's telling God about you right now. Job starts out telling us that there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And as it progresses, it says this, now there was a day when the sons of God, those are always angelic beings in the scripture, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth. Remember, he's cast out of heaven into the physical realm. I'm going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? So Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch your hand out and touch all he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. Job did nothing wrong. Job's not being punished. God points out his behavior in essence by saying, that's my boy. He's my child. He walks in my spirit as best he can. Satan shoots back that Job really doesn't love God, that he only loves all the blessings God gives him. He doesn't love the giver, he loves the gifts. And Satan says, just get rid of all of his blessings, and I'll prove to you that he actually has my spirit of self-interest, my spirit of self-will. He doesn't have your spirit of agape love, of self-sacrifice. He has my spirit of self-preservation, self-elevation, self-centeredness. That's my boy. I get him when he dies. Destroy his blessings, destroy his wealth, destroy his loved ones. He'll curse you just as I do. What you're seeing is a courtroom scene, and the trial is a paternity suit. It's the great cosmic who's your daddy. The trial, Job's trial, continues. Satan messes with him, kills all of his kids, he destroys all of his wealth, he destroys virtually everything that he has and leaves him with nothing. Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked came I from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. A couple of things here. First, note that Satan has to ask God permission to attack Job. God doesn't do this. Satan does, but God gives him permission. God is totally in control of Satan. Secondly, notice that Satan says, you stretch out your hand against him. Just like he was going to do later with the children of Israel using Nebuchadnezzar. And that God uses Satan to do that. Satan is a tool in God's hand, just like Nebuchadnezzar was when he destroyed Jerusalem. Whenever punishment or tempting or trial is on the scene, you know that it's not God directly doing it, because why? He can't. He is love. God is love and God is light. The Apostle James tells us that in his epistle. He says, don't anybody ever say when you're suffering and you're being tested that it's God tempting you. God cannot tempt anyone. He doesn't do that. Satan does. God gives permission, but there's permission for a purpose, and that's what we want to talk about here. Satan wants you to fail. He wants you to curse God by elevating yourself. In other words, what Satan wants is your worship. He does not want you to worship God. And that's a sign that you love God. No matter what happens, just like Job here, no matter what blessings you take away, I know you are God. I know you're good. I know you're love. I know you're light. And I know you're the only source of light and life in the universe. I will not curse you. I will worship you. Worship is when you give worth to something. And the highest worth that you give anything in the universe has to be to God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Satan wants to be what? Like God. I will be like the Most High. So what he's trying to do is get you to transfer your worship from God to him. And the way he does that is he dresses himself up as self-satisfaction, pleasure, all the things that you think will fulfill you as a human being. He throws all that out in front of you. It's like an evil father who looks good because he gives his child candy and soda, and he lets them play in the middle of the interstate, and whatever they want to do, he says, that's fine, you go do it. It's all about you, little princess. Do what you want. See how much I love you? You can go ahead and do what you want. And you don't know, the little child, how much danger they're in, how much damage they're causing. Same thing with sin. God wants you to prove that you are indeed his child, evidenced by having that agape spirit inside of you. And that's exactly what Job does here. No matter what Satan does to him, at God's permission, Job is still worshiping God. So Satan loses, right? Yeah, he doesn't give up that easy. Job chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. He's in the physical realm. The New Testament calls him the God of this age. Jesus called him the ruler of this world. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil, and still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. That's agape love. He's got my spirit. That's my boy. I get him when he dies. So Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. Yeah, all that a man has he will give for his life. In other words, his kids, his wealth, and everything. But stretch your hand out now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. You ever hear the phrase, he's just out to save his own skin? That's where this comes from. Satan has gone, as long as Job himself saved his own skin, he'll still worship you, even though you wiped out all of his kids and everything. He's probably thinking, I get more kids, and I can rebuild the camel herd and the sheep herd and all the rest of that. I'll get new servants and all. He doesn't really love you. He doesn't have agape spirit of love, self-sacrificial love in him. He's got my spirit in him. He's mine. I get him when he dies. Interesting. What we find with Job is that he still will not curse God after Satan afflicts him physically, horribly. What we find in Job is that at the end of the day, Job says, you know what, God? After this suffering, after having gone through all of this suffering, and me not finding out why you allowed this, I don't know why you did this. Remember, Job has no idea of what you and I just read. He has no idea that it's a paternity suit about which spirit is in him, about who his spiritual father is. He has no idea. He's clueless. And what God does in the rest of Job is he says, look, you have to love me. This is a test of love. If you have agape love in you, that proves you're mine. So what I have to do is not give you a reason to love me. What I have to do is just tell you the type of being that I am, that I'm this God, that I created everything that you can see, that I didn't ask for your permission and I didn't get any of your advice when I was doing it. You have to see how great and awesome I am, and then you have to just simply love me for who I am. That's how we know that you have true love, agape love in you. If I give you a reason, if I give you an excuse, you'll trust in the reason or the excuse rather than in my character of who I am. At the same time that that's going on, there's three friends of Job, and they know doctrine about God. And when you read what they say about God, it sounds like it could have come out of the Psalms. They're saying true things, but the application is wrong because they're telling Job, you must have sinned because God punishes evil, he punishes sin. So you must have sinned because there's all this bad stuff happening to you. When we know all along Job did nothing wrong, it wasn't punishment. And at the end of Job, what's really cool is God comes to the leader of these three guys and he goes, you know what, dude? You said things about me that aren't true. You acted like you know me, like I was your best bud and you knew all about me and you knew all about what was going on with Job. I didn't tell you any of that. I never said Job was being punished for sin. You spoke for me as if you knew me, as if we were hanging out. And that ain't the case. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to immediately go ask Job to pray for you. And if you don't, I'm going to take you out. So that's what happens at the end. And Job at the end, there's that famous phrase, I heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee. Job says, I knew doctrine about you before, but through this suffering, you showed up. I have been so close to you, I've learned more about you, your awesomeness through this suffering than I knew before. Now I know you personally. I don't just know about you. That spirit comes inside of you and me when we want Christ to do that, when we ask him to, when we beg for that mercy. And Jesus says, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Agape, self-sacrificial love for God. Paul says this, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. I've got his spirit in me because I've crucified that self-conscious, self-seeking spirit of sin. We're going to wrap it up here. In Revelation chapter 12, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Now you know what Satan is accusing you about, your paternity, your roots, whose spirit is inside of you. He's claiming you as his own, and the only test of the presence of God's spirit, of self-sacrifice, of agape love, is under the threat of death to self-will, when there is nothing that you can benefit from, but you will even go to your own death, whether that be death to your financial goals, death to your marital goals, death to your family goals for children, whatever it might be. When you die to that and you say, not my will, but thy will be done, that's how you know that you have the same spirit in you that you see in the Garden of Gethsemane in Jesus Christ. It is in the death of all of your I wills, I wills, I wills that Satan's accusations are proven false. You do not belong to him, but to God. You overcome his accusations first and foremost by the blood of the Lamb, Jesus on the cross, killing your own sin nature. You then overcome by the word of your testimony. That's what testimony means. It's in a courtroom. It's when what you claim to be true is tested by the opposing attorney. In this case, that's Satan. So what you claim about being a Christian, about being saved, has to be tested. And what we're looking for, what God and Satan are looking for, is which spirit is inside of you. Spirit of I will, or spirit of not my will, but thy will be done. If that spirit of self-sacrifice, not my will, thy will, is in you, you have the Spirit of Christ in you, and you are a child of God, not a child of the devil. Natural, unsaved human beings are governed by the survival instinct. Supernatural, saved human beings are governed by self-sacrifice, not self-survival. I'm going to wrap it up by going back to that Ark Covenant. I want to show you something. Remember, this was a coffin. Inside it was the Ten Commandments because the law condemns us to death. Jesus, however, kept the law perfectly. The law represents the character traits of God, and Jesus was God in human form. He was the glory of God in the tabernacle ceiling, covered by that plain old skin. He had the spirit of the law within him. The ark also had two other things in it, didn't it? It had a jar of manna, and Jesus said, I am the true manna of heaven. And the ark also had Aaron's staff, this piece of wood, this dead piece of wood that budded an almond branch. Now the almond was the very first fruit to be produced during the harvest season. And Jesus, Paul tells the Corinthians, is the first fruit from the dead. He was on that dead piece of wood, the cross, like Aaron's staff, but life came from it. Life comes from the cross, that other dead piece of wood. The ark is a representation of a coffin, the tomb of Jesus Christ. That's Jesus in there. But the literal ark prevented us from getting mercy, didn't it? No one could sit on this judgment seat and dispense mercy because of the two guarding cherubim who cover it. But Jesus had another tomb, didn't he? His body was laid in a tomb carved out of a hillside. And in those tombs, you can go still see them right now, what they would do is they would carve a flat slab out of the walls, and on that is where they would lay the body. Mark and Luke tell us that after the crucifixion, the women went inside Jesus' tomb and saw no body. But they did see two beings in radiant, gleaming white, one sitting on the right side of the slab. That's our mercy seat, my friends. The cherubs are no longer blocking the judgment of mercy on us. Satan is defeated. Death, where is your sting? If you are God's child, if his spirit tabernacles in you, dwells in you, proclaim his death until he comes, my brothers and sisters.